G'day legends, so here we are, we're getting towards the end of our time on ESPN. It has gone by so quickly since 2019. A lot of talk seems to be coming out about how the UFC aren't very happy with ESPN at all, how they fumbled the bag at UFC 313. People were having trouble buying the pay-per-views. UFC is unhappy at how many sales that they lost. And of course, as we all know, there's talk going around about how the UFC wants to shop itself out to places like Netflix. Yeah, TNT Sports are also interested today. If you didn't know, TNT Sports is technically owned by Warner Brothers Studios. That's one of the biggest rivals to Disney, and Disney, of course, own ESPN. So there's a lot going on here right now. Of course, the UFC, it's acting like it's the hot girl at the school. It's acting like it's the one that's leading the dance here, right? It's the end of year exams, school's wrapping up, everybody wants to know who's going to be smashing the hottie at the after party. Yeah, the TV deals are arguing about who is going to be the one to take a crack at her. But is the UFC, is she really as hot as she seems, or is she used goods? A lot of talk going around about how the UFC is selling itself, but I want you guys to just stop and listen. Take a look at this from ESPN's point of view. They acquired the rights to the UFC back in 2019. Now, this was peak McGregor mania. McGregor and Khabib had just broken the record for the most pay-per-view sales of all times. And if you don't think the UFC was showing them their charts of pay-per-views and how they were steadily going up, then I don't think you understand business very well. The UFC are there showing off to ESPN how much the pay-per-views are going up and up and up, and the UFC and ESPN, they go and they strike a deal. Now, us just being plebs on the internet, we don't know the exact numbers, but the reports and the rumors have been fairly consistent throughout the entire UFC ESPN deal, and it seems like the UFC is getting paid about 400,000 to 450,000 pay-per-view buys, no matter what the buys are. Now, we know that in 2019, it was very, very rare, astronomical, if a UFC pay-per-view would get 1 million buys. But we also know that an average card would get about 600,000 pay-per-view buys. And an absolutely horrific pay-per-view card, say, headlined by Amanda Nunes in Canada or something like that, with not a very strong undercard, that would get at least 300,000 to 350,000 pay-per-view buys. So everything sort of works out in the wash. ESPN pay them a flat rate for 400,000 pay-per-views, and Dana White goes ahead and sails the rest, keeps the rest, right? Now, of course, the big lie hits us in 2020. Everything in the world is cancelled. Every sport in the world, flights, country, just everything is cancelled for the big lie in 2020. But Dana White, he doesn't really care what global governments say, and he's going to go ahead and he's going to keep putting on shows no matter what. The Apex is born. Obviously, it already existed for Tough and Contender Series, but the Apex as we know it today is truly born. A closed-off warehouse that can be completely wiped down with antiseptic for no good reason at all, and the fights can go on. And in 2020, the UFC Apex becomes the holy grail of ESPN and Disney. It is the one thing that kept everybody's business afloat week in, week out, while the fights were still going on. However, as early as February 2021, crowded events did start back up. Super Bowl 2001, February 7th, very early in 2021. Did I say 2001? I meant 2021, right? Super Bowl kicks off. The NFL has allowed 25,000 fans into the stadium in Florida. So we started to refill arenas again, and the UFC started shopping itself from city to city to start putting shows on. Abu Dhabi, for instance, pays the UFC about $25 million per show. Perth and Sydney, they both struck financial deals with the UFC. Sydney is apparently spending about $16 million for its deal. Saudi Arabia paid the UFC to come to town. And it's not just international cities around the world that pay for the UFC to come there. There's US cities as well that pay for the UFC to go there. The UFC start following a very similar model to the F1. We're an event, we're a show, we're coming to your city, you pay us to be there because we bring in tourism from around the region, yep? So now the UFC has got this financial security coming from cities all over the world. The UFC knows that it's also going to get guaranteed pay-per-view buys from ESPN, and it's going to get guaranteed money from the city as well hosting it. So the UFC doesn't need to sell the card as much as it did in 2019 and before. The mix of ESPN paying a flat rate for average pay-per-view buys and the city covering the rest, plus the exorbitant ticketing prices on the gate, because the UFC is starving fans by traveling rarely. It goes to cities that it doesn't try to go to often as it's setting up these deals and driving up the ticket prices. The entire card is paid for with the profit before any names on the pay-per-view even need to be worried about. Now, this is going to piss off ESPN greatly, because it means without the UFC even trying to sell the pay-per-view cards, ESPN's deal is kind of worthless. Like, it's paying for these stacked cards, you know, so it has some bad ones, but it has some great ones, and it's winning in the end. But without the UFC trying to sell pay-per-views at all now, ESPN is sort of screwed here. ESPN is guaranteed a certain amount of pay-per-view buys because they're expecting that there's going to be more. It's paying the average amount because it's expecting that the UFC is actually going to go out and actually try and sell pay-per-views. You know, get over that 400,000 pay-per-view mark, rather than the average these days sort of coming in underneath it. The UFC, it doesn't need to worry about it. Those extra 100,000 pay-per-view buys or so on top of the 400,000, they're already going to be guaranteed. They're going to be guaranteed by the cost of the ticket price and the cost of the city. And also, the UFC is saving money on the other end. It's subsidizing any money it might lose by remaining at the apex well into 2025. And now the brand rights deal is coming up. ESPN are coming back to the negotiating table, and UFC is acting like the little hottie that puts out all the time, but apparently she doesn't. She doesn't put out nearly as much as she promised. And the question should not be, who is the UFC going to be re-signing with? But it should be, I mean, if I was the board of director of Netflix, if I was the CEO of Warner Brothers, I would be asking myself, why isn't ESPN doing everything they can to keep the UFC? Why is ESPN allowing Dana White to just go out and start flirting with everybody else to try and get ESPN jealous? ESPN dropped the ball at UFC 313. They don't seem to be trying that hard to keep the UFC there. And Dana White, how dedicated to the company is the president of the UFC? How dedicated is Dana White? Dana White, who's also running Power Slap, who is also now on the board of directors at Facebook for some reason, who is also working with Turkshay Ali to try and get a new boxing league up and off the ground. What the hell are these copy and pasted promotional tools that we get for every single card? What happened to the build-up of Jose Aldo versus Conor McGregor? How come now it's just a couple of episodes of embedded on YouTube? We follow the fighters around getting haircuts, and then we get a 15-minute press conference with the fans. The 15-minute press conference where it's just John Morgan asking the same goddamn question every single month. Are you excited for this weekend's fight? And then the pay-per-views have gone all the way up to $80. Why is anyone interested in this is the real question. On top of that comes all the other things that come along with it. How easy is it to actually get a pay-per-view absolutely free off the internet? And of course, with these horrible cards that keep happening, you're educating the fan base to consistently go back to those sites. I mean, once you have lost a fan to pay-per-view, you have lost that fan forever. Once you find a working link for a pay-per-view, all you do is click bookmark, and that link is always in your browser. Now it becomes a question of, it's Saturday night, I'm sitting down, I'm ready to go. Do I spend $80 on gambling and beer, or do I spend $80 on this subpar pay-per-view card? Yeah, UFC 307, Caitlin Vieira, Kevin Holland, Mario Batista, Raquel Pennington, the ranked 7th, coming off a loss, drug suspension, Khalil Roundtree getting fed to the best striker in the UFC. How is that worth $80, man? I say best striker in the UFC because going into UFC 307, I mean, Alex Pereira was the guy. You say one bat, you don't put Alex Pereira as number 1 on your pound for pound list, they come after you. Thank God we got big anked. The entire MMA community got humbled there. Here's the truth going into the TV rights deal. The UFC have pulled one of the greatest bait and switches on ESPN in sporting history over the last couple of years. Conor is gone. The Apex is king. Pay-per-views are paid for before the event is even put together in the war room, so the promotion for said pay-per-views has completely fizzled up. Dana White is now actively anti-promoting some of his potential stars, yeah? Bilal Muhammad head slams Leon Edward in front of all of the English fans. Wasn't exactly a barn burner, was it? Tom Aspinall rips through the entire heavyweight division in an average fight time of about a round. He's a good kid. Maybe one day he'll earn a shot at the title. The real question isn't where is the UFC going to go next? The real question is, why the fuck would anyone at ESPN or Warner Brothers want to pay top dollar for a product that fans can get for free off the internet and the UFC is barely fucking refusing to sell anyway? So there we go. That's my thoughts on the UFC's upcoming TV rights deal. Who's going to be lucky enough to get her, boys? Who's going to be lucky enough to get 40 events a year at the Apex? Who wants to pay the big cash for cards like UFC 307? Unbelievable. That's that. Let me know what you think about it down there in the comments. What do you reckon the UFC is actually worth, right? What do you reckon a UFC pay-per-view is actually worth? Let me know about that down there in the comments. If this is your first time here, g'day, my name's Dougie. I try and make an MMA video every day of the week, Monday through Friday, and I go live at least 3 times a week. You want to know when all that happens, you hit that subscription button down there. You hit that note. Unlike the UFC, it's free, mate. It's bloody free. All this content is bloody free. Hit that notification bell down there. If you like the video, you're already on board with the channel, please give it a like. Help the channel grow. I really appreciate that. And if you're one of the paying members of the channel, yeah, subscription's free, but you can pay for extra content. Then thank you so much. Your names are up on the next slide. If you want to know what that extra content is, it's like meme videos, tier lists of American food, blood, you know, there's great stuff. But emojis in the live chat, there used to be a foot emoji, but the chat gambled it against Alex Pereira, funnily enough. And that's that. And also, it's Friday, so that's the last video of the week. I will see you all for UFC London main card. I'll be live for it. And until then, you guys have a great weekend. See ya.